is our guest. Thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to sit with us.
It's always a pleasure to be with you and to try to have a conversation around what I think are important issues.
Absolutely. It's been a while. It's almost 2 years, isn't it, that we sat?
Time flies, you see. Time
Absolutely.
flies. But in that time, unfortunately, we've had major issues around our economy and around the whole situation of the nation and pensioners and bondholders. So it's been a busy time.
Did you invest in any government bonds?
No, I didn't.
I'm sure sitting down and watching your fellow age mates and pensioners, that certainly was concerning for you.
Of course it was, and it's something that is an ongoing problem, but it's a problem that relates to the future of our economy and its growth and its recovery from the current situation, because it is that growth of the economy that is going to generate the resources. And it takes my mind back actually to, what happened in the 80s when, again, Ghana was in a deep economic situation, a deeply troubling economic situation. And it was in that time, the economic recovery program and so on, it was in that time actually that the whole thinking about the National Petroleum Corporation, oil and gas becoming an important part of the nation's recovery, the whole thinking began around that time. And one would hope that, again, with the right thinking and the right approaches, oil and gas can make a contribution to the future and to the sustained recovery of our economy.
And it's important that you make reference to even that period, because right from the 83 down to 88, when you stepped into the GMPC, to the period that you were there for about 12 years or so as a chief executive officer. Tell us what exactly you did during that period to, as it were, develop Ghana's capacity of commercial production of crude oil.
Well, actually, just one little point I should make about some of your earlier comments. The first commercial oil production in Ghana was from the Salt Pond field in the late 70s. It wasn't 2007 that was the first commercial production, but it was a relatively small amount. Just to set that record
Absolutely.
straight.
It's important.
But in the 80s, building on what had begun to be done, we sort of had to look again at the whole framework for the oil and gas sector. At that time, it was really part of the general mineral sector. And so the laws were part of the general minerals laws.
Right.
And there was the PNDC Secretary for Fuel and Power, as it was called then, the Ministry of Fuel and Power, Mr. Apia Koran. He actually initiated a lot of steps to make sure that there was a review of that mineral legal framework in the light of the current reality of the oil and gas sector. Because, by then a lot had happened in relation to oil. OPEC had begun to be, a very powerful player. National oil companies had begun to be formed. And he sought assistance from the United Nations Center for Transnational Corporations. At that time, Nana Dr. Asante, was a director in the legal department of the UN Center for Transnational Corporations. And under his watch, they assigned a consultancy firm, I think it was called Tsatsu Associates, a consultancy firm from New York, which was very knowledgeable about the oil and gas business, to start that process of reviewing the legal framework that existed and beginning to put in place a new legal framework. And it was in the course of that he also decided to set up, a local team that would be the counterparts of Tsatsu Associates, so that we would work with them, especially, some of the lawyers here who could, look at the laws, and look at whatever review proposals they had in the light of the framework that we already had. So that's where I came in. And, I was also then involved in a committee that I chaired, which was the committee that began to negotiate new agreements with interested investors. Because again, the ministry by then embarked on a promotion of the oil and gas, potential of Ghana to international investors. And the ministry was able to get new data, new seismic data on the offshore, on the basis of which it began to invite, new investment. So, I mean, I think, Mr. Aker Energy and the team at the ministry at that time, did a lot of groundwork on the basis of which, these committees really put together a framework that really involved 3 laws at that time. It was the Petroleum Exploration and Production Law, the GNPC law, and then the Petroleum Income Tax Law. So this was the sort of the trio of laws that now separated the oil and gas sector from the general mineral regime, because the mineral regime covered hard rock minerals, gold, manganese, bauxite, and so on. But for the first time, we had a separate set of laws that addressed the oil and gas sector. And I think it's significant that in that period, a decision was taken to create a national oil company, because it was evident from what was happening around the globe that national oil companies were going to have an important role. I mean, as I said, that was when, OPEC was coming to its own. Companies like Saudi Aramco and so on were becoming known as a force to reckon with, and their contributions to the economies of their countries were clearly recognized. So it was in that frame of thinking that I believe, the government at the time, the PNDC, and particularly the sector PNDC secretary, began to situate GNPC, a national corporation, which would now drive the agenda of trying to find oil, trying to produce it, and make it a vehicle for developing the economy of Ghana. That I think was broadly the agenda that we sought to pursue. And in that context, you have to remember also that Ghana had a situation where soon after December 31st, 1981, Nigeria decided to withhold supplies of oil and so on. And in that sort of period, it was felt that there was some urgency about us finding our own oil and producing it and not being at the mercy of Nigeria or any other supplier. So that was the setting. But I think one final thing that I should highlight is that this was also in a period when the dependence of Ghana on hydro resources was becoming problematic, years of drought and so on. So we began to look at gas and the importance of gas. And I make this point because right from even the first law that was established in terms of GNPC's role, gas was stated as a priority for GNPC to address.
I see. And so, because after the commercial discovery and production after 2010, then there was a lot of conversation about the gas aspect of it, which led to the setting up of the Ghana National Gas Company, because we had substantial ownership of the gas component. But I want to find out, between 1988, when you got into the thick of things at the GNPC, till you got out, what were the specific, apart from the laws that you mentioned, the specific building blocks that led to the commercial production in 2007?
That's a very important question. And the key thing that we did was to establish the capacity of a national company to interact with the international industry. That meant having people who were skilled in geosciences, geology, geophysics, engineering, drilling engineering and reservoir engineering and so on. And the good news for Ghana at that time was that having a far-sighted first president like President Nkrumah, a number of Ghanaians had been trained in various countries, including people trained in Romania, Bulgaria, as well as in the West, in Imperial College, London, and so on. So there were people who already were trained in the industry. Some of them happened to be working in the international industry. So one of the first things that we tried to do was to build a core of people that had the requisite capabilities to interact with the international industry. Because if you're promoting your potential, I mean, you can't do it just by relying on foreign experts.
So the human resource.
The human resource is key. You've got to make sure that there are people who can address the international industry in terms of what the international industry expects to hear. In technical terms, it's not a political investment promotion event. It's largely a technically driven activity. And as I said, we fortunately had a number of well-trained Ghanaians already. Some of them had been working, for instance, in the Geological Survey. Some had been working in the old petroleum department when, they began to sort of do some of the exploration related to Salt Pond particularly. There had been some young, engineers and geologists who were already working in the petroleum department. So when that petroleum department got converted to become the nucleus of the Ghana National Petroleum Corporation, some of them were there. And then we got in additional, human resources, Ghanaians from out there. I remember very well one of the people who subsequently became an exploration manager in GMPC, Mr. Apiache. He had worked for Phillips Petroleum for a long time. And Phillips Petroleum was one of the companies who were active in Ghana. They made some discoveries, North and South Tunnel, and so on. So somebody like him being able to come and join the team, we already had people like Nana Asafuaje and Joe Clemesu and people, I remember some of the names, but I'm forgetting some others. They should forgive me. But Ajay Akpo and people who had been geologists from the Geological Survey. And so they formed the nucleus. And, I really am very proud of the sort of capacity that we were able to bring together of Ghanaians, because it was always a joy having such capacity when we interacted with the most, powerful international oil companies in the world, because they matched their counterparts in their knowledge. In fact, I would say that one of the things that became obvious was that the team in GMPC was more knowledgeable consistently than any of the companies that we interacted with
companies?
When it came to our own our own potential with the data regarding our own country. Right. The team in GMPC was certainly a team that excelled beyond any shadow of doubt, and it made it very easy because you see in the petroleum agreements we also had provisions when we were partnering with international companies, whereby some of our people would go and work with them in their offices on secondment and so on. And, they soon realized that these were people who were coming not as sort of interns or, as new graduates, but they were coming really to share knowledge, from what they had gathered in relation to Ghana's prospects. And that was always a very positive element, which, so it meant that in the period from the establishment of GMPC and the active operations. We started actively operating from about February, March 85, I remember. And from that period, when we started signing agreements with companies like Amoco, like Shell, Unocal, and Arco, we started signing agreements with a number of, significant international companies. And those agreements led to a new phase of exploration, especially in the offshore western part of Ghana. And that really laid the foundation for the major mahogany discovery in 2007. Because in fact, the company that had done a lot of work in that area, which Cosmos sort of inherited, that was a company called Hunt Oil, and basically with GMPC, Hunt Oil had identified a lot of prospects in that area. And I remember, people like Thomas Menu, the geophysicist in GMPC at that time, were the ones who presented some of this material to the Cosmos team that was, being newly established after they'd, been part of a previous company. And, I think people have to appreciate that, oil exploration is not just some kind of wave a magic wand one day, and then the oil is found. It is a very systematic build-up. And one of the important things too about GMPC's existence was that because we had a national company, a national corporation that was always a partner to whichever foreign entity is working here, the people in GMPC had a more global view of the geology, the geophysics and so on. They had, more access to the data than any of these individual companies working in the individual blocks. So when somebody like Thomas Menu or, Nana Safuaje, who was his boss at that time, and some of the other geophysicists, Ferdinand Aniwa, may he rest in peace, really solid, geoscientists, when they would speak about Ghana's potential, they spoke authoritatively. And, being in a position, as Thomas was in those days, to put forward to the Cosmos team, this already well-established set of prospects that had been mapped and so on with Hunt Oil, it made it a compelling proposition. So it wasn't difficult for them to buy into that. And of course, I like to tell those geoscientists that I'm sure if they had the money themselves, they would have put the money where their mouth is.
Because it was just obvious based on the data that there was enough reason to make that exploration.
Exactly.
It's a very interesting point to make about the human resource potential, because after commercial production, the conversation has been how many Ghanaians are actually playing key roles in the expertise, the technical aspect of things. And especially because now, as we speak, there's this whole local content which is meant to, as it were, transfer knowledge from these experts to Ghanaians. Because if you look at the chain, a lot of Ghanaians who are employed within this oil sector are below, the ladder. And so there was that arrangement to get a lot more Ghanaians get the expertise. But with what you're saying, there are people who were there. So where's the disconnect? What happened to the extent that after your period into 2007, we did not see that continuous increase in the Ghanaians being trained to get the level of expertise to take up the mantle of leadership?
First of all, you've got to remember that in 2001, there were people who thought that GMPC should be more or less cut to size. And in that period, 2001, 2007, quite a number of GMPC personnel, including technical people, were either, sacked or, they themselves left because they didn't see much of a future for them within the organization. It was made as if GMPC had tried to be too ambitious or something, and so, for some people,
being too ambitious?
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. In fact, I think it was that, kind of drive of GMPC in that period that enabled some of these people to distinguish themselves. Some of the talent that I referred to, which was, there, was able to distinguish itself, to come to the surface and to be acknowledged within the industry. And as I said, that's something we can all feel very good about. So it wasn't just something about me as chief executive, but it was really that capacity that was spread through, all the sort of technical divisions of the corporation. Now, I think it's also important to highlight the fact that GMPC capacity by itself is not sufficient local content, because in fact, one of the things that was stated as a key object of GMPC from the beginning and in the law that was set up, one of the key objects was obtaining the effective transfer to Ghana of appropriate technology relating to petroleum operations, ensuring the training of citizens of Ghana, the development of national capabilities in all aspects. Now, this again is something that has to happen over time as a number of different operations are conducted and you have your people engaged with the different operations. Amoco is there, you have people from GMPC working with them, Shell is doing something, you have people from GMPC, so that is what really enables that sort of technological transfer to occur. Because, Ghana simply was not at a place where there was already a locally established framework for making sure that, we would get things up and running with, discoveries and so on. So over time, you needed to build all this capacity. And I think that, that happened. Now, you made reference to local content. You've got to go beyond just having one national corporation to a situation where in the supply of goods and services for this very capital-intensive operation, you make sure also that Ghanaians are more engaged. So, if an oil company is coming to be involved in exploration, they're going to bring in a lot of equipment. They're going to be hiring people, for instance, on drilling rigs. Quite often, all companies come in assuming that there's not enough local capacity, so they bring in foreigners at all levels. But if you are able to demonstrate to them that they're capable Ghanaians who can take up some of these positions, then it becomes, more and more local content evolving, and people begin to appreciate that Ghana does have a pool of, human capacity that makes it unnecessary, to bring on board entirely, foreigners. That again ensures that by the time you're generating revenue from the production, you're not having so much that's going into cost recovery, which is just going out, but you are having some of that cost recovery actually related to Ghanaian goods and services. So it's important to have that continuous process of developing local capacity. But again, that leads to another complication because, we train a lot of Ghanaians over the last couple of decades. But in recent years, the industry has gone into some degree of stagnation in Ghana. There's not much new activity. So, for instance, in Takoradi, you have a lot of, industries and so on companies that developed activities around oil and gas, and currently they have nothing to do.
That's true in the West Cape 3-point area.
So basically, you have to make sure that local content is matched by increasing investment, from the international industry, because we know that as a country, we really do not have the resources by ourselves to make the investments that are needed for ongoing exploration, ongoing increase in production, and so on. And that's why, we also, as we're trying to develop the local content, we also have to make sure that the investment levels are ongoing, they're continuing, and that we are having, the sort of opportunities that Ghanaians need to, provide their services to different investors and get benefits. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of local content, but it also depends on getting more investment activity into the oil and gas sector.
So, and a quick one on this, because I want us to move into the impact that this oil discovery has made over the period. I mean, if I talk about a bigger commercial discovery from 2007, taking into consideration the 80s, what was also discovered. It's been 16 years, at least if we're counting from 2007 to date. Does the current legal framework safeguard the evolution that this oil sector, our oil sector, has gone through over the period since we started commercial production?
I think it largely does, frankly, and I think we should be a little bit careful about imagining that, making changes in laws.
There's been called for a review of the framework to address current challenges that
but what are the current challenges that people are talking about? I think the reality is that the legal framework is adequate to meet the current challenges. There may be some respects, and I'll give an example in a minute. There may be some respects in which consideration can be given to some amendments and so on. But in terms, broadly speaking, the existing legal framework, I think, does the job and has been effective over the last, few decades in attracting the investment that was needed. I think that we do have to look at our own sort of working of the legal framework. When I say our own working of the legal framework, here's what I mean. For example, you have within the legal framework, the law and the agreement framework, you have clear provisions that when the company that has come in, the foreign company that has come in with its investment, when it's made, when it's recovered its costs in relation to some of the equipment, for instance, that it has brought in, an FPSO, the subsea infrastructure, and so on, GNPC effectively should become the owner of that infrastructure, because GNPC's perspective may go beyond just that one field that company is focused on. GNPC may be looking at ways of bringing in other fields into that same infrastructure. So the legal framework provided for GNPC becoming the owner, but that requires GNPC to do a proper accounting of all this cost recovery as is going on from the beginning. So from 2010, when Jubilee oil production, for instance, began, it will be important to try to find out, for instance, whether GNPC is clear about how much cost recovery has successfully taken place, and therefore which assets can become theirs 100%. Because when those assets become theirs, they are able then to tie in additional production from nearby. Here we are in a situation, for instance, where we've talked about the Aker situation. Aker, they came into a block where 7 discoveries had already been made by Hess, and Hess decided to exit Ghana. Now, that immediately provided an opportunity for GNPC itself to see whether even some of its existing infrastructure could be tied with any of these new discoveries, just as an example. So GNPC, has got to be proactive in identifying value opportunities from the work that has been going on with, these foreign investors and so on, and making sure that it generates more and more national value, and not always kind of passively expect that, the foreign companies are, going to do it all for the country, because frankly, they are not going to do it all.
Indeed. It's good that you make mention of the Aker Energy, because that's another area that I want us to get into quite close, because recently, the minority in Parliament have actually called for an investigation into that $1.65 billion deal, because eventually one of the companies has actually decided to pull out. In fact,
it's not only the minority in Parliament that has raised issues about this transaction. From the onset, when it was announced, a lot of civil society organizations,
indeed, about 29 of them,
exactly,
last time I read, raised fundamental questions about.
And those questions are indeed quite straightforward, and frankly, I think it is good for this country that in the end, that transaction did not go forward. Because it's very simple. I mean, how does GNPC, which has been a partner, to Aker, in a situation where Aker has made commitments to undertake the appraisal and development of the fields that are in that block, how does GNPC suddenly say, or the government suddenly say, I'm going to borrow 1.6 billion in order to buy a stake which we gave to Aker in the first place? I mean, frankly, it didn't make any sense whatsoever, because, if Aker didn't do what it committed itself to do, the block would come back to GNPC, and GNPC can either find a partner or, find the right, technology providers to help it, to undertake the development itself. So it really didn't make any sense and the government, at that time, you remember a few years ago, the government already, had its own debt problems. They were going to incur debt, 1.6 billion, to give to GNPC, to give to a Norwegian billionaire and his company. I mean, that really, I was amazed by that, because any way you look at it, it was not a transaction that was going to be beneficial for Ghana. And it is significant, as you've said, that subsequent events have just exposed the reality that that transaction was not a good transaction for Ghana. And I think going forward, one of the things that I'm very interested in looking at is, what is GNPC's take on those discoveries that have been made, those 7 discoveries, Pecan, Paradise, Beach, and some others. Yeah. What is his own plan to address those discoveries? Because it seems to me that existing discoveries and being able to monetize those discoveries has to be a priority for GNPC. So if we look at the expenditure priorities for GNPC in a year, for instance, and we find that $45 million was spent in 2020 in so-called sustainability, activities, social responsibility things, and so on. And yet, what was put in, for instance, in that year to the Sankofa Ginyami production was a fraction, like less than $8 million, according to the records that we can all look at. I mean, it tells you that there's a bit of a mismatch, because sustainability depends on getting increasing production and increasing revenue. But if you spend so much more on sustainability at the expense of your actual production, then clearly there's a problem. In fact, if you look at some of the reports of the Public Interest and Accountability Committee, PIAC, in that period, 2020-2021, they are highlighting the fact that in respect of Sankofa, Ginyami, as well as Jubilee and 10, there's some problems with what they call gas handling, and it requires investment to ensure that the gas from those fields is actually exported so that it doesn't compromise oil production in the future. There are very serious issues raised in that period. So in my mind, the priorities, the capital expenditure priorities that are associated with getting increasing oil production must be, you know, the top part of the agenda. Must be, you know, really, they cannot be sacrificed for anything else. But you have a situation where, you know, you're spending so much more on sustainability than, and you know that was also an election year. So
absolutely. And in fact, a lot of questions were raised about the kind of activities that the CSR money was, GMPC CSR money was going into. But if I recall, if I have a copy of the said memo on this Aker Energy deal, which definitely did not go through. The $1.3 billion was for acquiring Aker's interest, and $350 million was for development cost of Pecan Phase 1.
That's the share of GMPC in the development cost, correct?
And the justification of the Minister of Energy was that it's quoted that more experience is needed for the exploration of GMPC's agenda, and in fact, to the extent that Exploco had to be involved in the energy transition process, so it was key that this deal had to go through.
No,
that
I'm
was
sorry,
the justification.
Absolutely not. I mean, I don't think that those justifications hold any water whatsoever. Apart from anything else, frankly, Aker, you know, as Aker, a separate company, did not have the kind of technical capability that it could effectively transfer to GMPC.
They didn't have the technical.
They did not have it because Aker, in the context of what they're doing in the North Sea, they work with BP. They have a joint venture with BP, and the operator is BP, not Aker. So this Ghana operation was the first context in which Aker was going to be an operator. And frankly, I cannot see why GMPC could not, you know, have that capacity. And frankly, you know, this distinction, Exploco, GMPC, I don't think it's so important. We should look at them all as GMPC. GMPC and the capacity that they had and the ability that they had, either with any new partner or by themselves, you know, bringing in whatever technical services they needed, would have been able to spend this 1.3 billion in a more effective way, in my opinion. Rather than hand it over and then 300 million is supposed to be used for the development. If Aker did not want to make the investment, then it would have to relinquish the interest, and then it would be 100% GMPC. So why would GMPC have to pay Aker for something that they had given Aker in the first place? You know, GMPC gave up significant stake in that block in order to serve as an incentive for Aker to bring in the money to do the appraisal and development of the Pecan field.
So if GMPC wanted to take, or the government of Ghana wanted to take 37% of the stake, which we're going to pay the $1.3 billion for, it should have ordinarily just come back to us.
Absolutely.
Without any cost.
Without any cost, because if they are not prepared to make the investment in terms of what commitments they made at the beginning. The commitments were that we are buying this interest from Hess, and they bought it at a pretty low price from Hess. It was not all the investments that Hess had made that they paid for. I think they paid $25 million to get into that block. And then there was a kind of contingent payment that was going to be about 75 million if a plan of development was approved, which then they would have to pay to HES. So basically 25 million. And based on that, we are now, a few years later, buying 37% for 1.3 billion. I mean, what sort of justification can you find for that situation? Frankly, I think it's very hard to justify that sort of scenario. And as I'm insisting, the legal framework, the agreements provide that if the companies which have made commitments to risk their capital to develop the resources, if they no longer wish to do that, then they walk away, like HES. HES didn't want to put any more money into Ghana. They had made some big discoveries in Guyana, which they were more interested in pursuing single-mindedly. So they sort of sold it almost for nothing to Aker. And now we are hearing that Aker itself is selling for $1 to the AFC, the Africa Finance Corporation. Now, I mean, frankly, again, the legal framework allows GMPC to preempt that transaction, because GMPC can say, well, if you're selling it for $1, I'm willing to pay that $1, and on that basis, it should come to me. And so I think that there is enough in the legal framework for GNPC to be able to have a proactive role in ensuring that there is national value being realized, rather than all the time the value going outside. I think that transaction would have been a disaster, because that $1 billion, I mean, it would take a long, long time for even that cost to be recovered, much less any revenue being generated, any return on that investment being generated from the Pecan field. I mean, I don't think that anybody can, convince me that there was justification in terms of energy transition. In fact, the thing about the energy transition is that it makes it more important for our national company to protect the national interest in a way that may be different from what the international companies and the international financial institutions are doing. Clearly, Aker was having difficulty in raising the money to advance its objective, because these days, in the midst of energy transition and so on, financial institutions are hesitant. I mean, when you have big companies like the Exxon Mobils, the Shells and Chevrons and so on, based on their balance sheet, they are able to raise money and get on with their activity. But a company like Aker is looking to raise money, from financial institutions, and because of the energy transition situation, they're not able to, raise that money. So it seems to me that it is a question of a national company, stepping in and finding ways of raising that sort of capital to develop, as opposed to buying back a stake that they already gave in the first instance.
So really, GMPC did not need Aker to become an operator? Really?
No, not really, because, I mean, and in any case, we've seen since then that, Aker itself has decided to wash their hands for $1. This is something that they had earlier expressed a strong interest in developing, and on that basis, they asked for incentives to be given to them. Those incentives included sacrificing what had been part of Exploco's interest and giving it to them. A lot of concessions were made to them to make it possible for them to undertake the appraisal and development that they committed themselves to. But in the end, it has come to nothing. I mean, if we are told that some management from Aker is going to be there working with Africa Finance Corporation, I mean, GMPC is able also to find the right, team, technically the right expertise to work with it in order to undertake the development. So, I mean, having a management in place from Aker, in a situation where Aker now has no risk capital involved whatsoever, I frankly think that is really an unfortunate situation.
Some say
us to
actually
be in.
that some of these deals get onto the table. In fact, they get approved because of the politicization of the entire GMPC itself. And so it's one of the reasons why there has to be a review, so that the CEO who is there has the right knowledge, expertise, understands exactly the vision he or she is driving, plus the board members as well know exactly what they want to achieve with every decision they take. That's one of the reasons why they want.
Yeah, but that doesn't require changing laws. When I was running GMPC, I had a board which had, people like Dr. JLS Abe, may his soul rest in peace, people like Mr. Parker, people like the former director of Geological Survey, Mr. Banson. I mean, the people who are appointed to the board, I mean, they should be the right people who can make a contribution. That doesn't require change of the law in order for the right choices to be made. In any context, choices of personnel have to be made to institutions. And I don't think it's the change in the law that makes it possible to make the right choices. I think that it is always possible to make the right choices. And, when we see an organization like GMPC, which has so much potential, it should be of concern to us to ensure, and it's good that, civil society organizations and so on are raising issues about, some of the people in certain positions and so on. But it doesn't require change in the law in order to get those things addressed.
In fact, so that actually ties into something that happened recently. As we're talking about the personnel in there and the people in decision-making positions in a critical institution like GNPC, recently the board chair of the GNPC, Freddie Blay, who is former chairman of the ruling NPP, together with the CEO, incurred the wrath of the energy minister because of the alleged steps which were initiated to sell Jubilee Oil Holdings Limited's 50% interest in the South Deepwater Tunnel block. And the fact that the minister says that he had actually given a directive that should not be done. That transaction shouldn't take place between GMPC and the South African institution. But later found out that there has been an initial step taken by the board chair at his blind side as well. This is something I know you follow quite critically as well.
Well, I followed it not in too much detail, but there are certain intriguing aspects of that whole disputation between the minister and the board chair. I mean, starting with the board chair's position, the explanations that I have read have to do with PetroSA exercising a right of preemption in respect of the Anadarko divestiture. Now, I mean, frankly, that is a very, weak kind of justification because, well, weak is actually a generous word because, I mean, the time of preemption has long passed. When Anadarko was about to exit, at that time, within the group, that is Anadarko's, foreign partners, at that time, what the agreement requires them to do is to indicate to the participants, their partners, their co-investors, that we want to exit, and this is maybe something has been offered to us by Total Energy or something. But if you can match it, then you can have the interest that we have. Right. Now, so at that time, if PetroSA wanted to exercise a right of preemption, they were entirely at liberty to do that. But you don't wait until a situation now where GNPC has made the acquisition, and then you say that in the name of preemption, you are selling 50%. I mean, that, again, there's no framework of preemption in this. Basically, it's an attempt to sell a 50% stake. And I think that if that's what it is, I mean, they should try to justify it in terms of the value for Ghana, of what they are trying to sell, and so on. Not this argument about preemption, because frankly, the legal structure about preemption cannot be applied to that situation, because the preemption situation has passed. It was a time when Anadako was selling, and GNPC, again, under the legal framework, has its own ability to preempt. That's also independent of what the partners among themselves can do. So GNPC, under the Petroleum Exploration and Production Law, the Act, is able to preempt. And they exercise that preemption. And it's interesting that Tullow Oil also exercised a preemption right. So part of, and they were approved to do the preemption at that time. So part of what, GNPC would have got, in the end, it was ceded to Tullow at that time. So if PetroSA at that time also wanted to be part of the preempt, then they would have put forward themselves, and within that context, the preemption could have been addressed, comprehensively. Yeah, but that was in the past. So after all that is done, GNPC has a stake, and then now later you say that you're going to sell 50% of it. That's a different transaction. Essentially, it's a transaction in which you now want to sell part of the stake of GNPC, and you need to justify it as such. You don't justify it in terms of preemption and so on of PetroSA, because there's
that period had elapsed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, but you see, there's also something interesting in relation to what I read about the concerns of the minister in respect of the JOHL, Jubilee Oil Holdings Limited entity, which is registered in the Cayman Islands. And, I mean, I noted that there is a reference to some payments that are going to be made to Litasco in connection with which some commitments seem to have been made.
Between the two institutions, yes. Exactly.
So there is an attempt to protect, as it were, the payments to Litasco from, being affected by another transaction that, GNPC undertakes. Now, I think we need to know a bit more about this transaction with Litasco, because, as far as I can understand it, if the transaction is by way of like a loan to GNPC, there are issues about how consistent it is with the current legal framework in which there is a provision of the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, which requires all the receipts, all revenues, received from, oil sales and so on, to go into the Petroleum Holding Fund. Now, I mean, you can't just use an entity which is created by GNPC, but because it is put in the Cayman Islands, you can't just use that device in order to avoid doing what the law requires in terms of, payment into the Petroleum Holding Fund, out of which then various disbursements are made. I mean, that's the legal structure that we have. I mean, to be honest, I have some concerns that that legal structure may sometimes be an unnecessary constraint on GNPC, but that is what we have at the moment. And I'll come back to explain what I mean by the constraints on GNPC. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the important point is that we have a clear legal framework requiring that these, sales of oil and the revenues derived therefrom should go into the petroleum fund. Now, if GNPC has essentially a subsidiary, because JOHL is nothing other than a subsidiary of GNPC. It was established by GNPC in order to, exercise rights in connection with the asset. Now, if GNPC finds that, it wants to raise money and there is a problem because of that provision in the law, that's the issue that, again, must be faced. You don't more or less go in contradiction with the law, and then you're raising money. I think Litasco is supposed to be the entity that is providing the funding. But again, is that a transparent process? Were there invitations to others to raise equivalent, funding? Because I know that there are many financial institutions, in Japan, in Germany, in Korea and so on. There are many institutions of some of these countries which are dependent on oil imports, where they are able to provide very soft long-term capital, by way of a prepayment. So, Litasco, is a private company whose terms may need to be compared with what can be obtained from elsewhere, in order to see whether that's a valid kind of, value proposition for the country. So, really, when you look at the representations, both from the chairman of GNPC and from the ministry, there are a lot of issues about which I think more explanation needs to be provided and more justification for particular transactions, because otherwise it then becomes almost as if various powerful players each have a particular transaction that they want to undertake. And, they are sort of at loggerheads in terms of the transactions that they want to take. One of the striking things also for me, especially in relation to GNPC, is that, the GNPC chairman is supposed to be a non-executive chairman. Yes. So, in this transaction, the descriptions don't suggest that he is playing a non-executive role. And that itself is a problem, And, it is possible to have an executive chairman, but at the moment, the framework...
And the framework says it's non-executive chair.
Exactly.
So cannot take part in, for instance, such decisions as to...
Well,
does he have the power to do what he...
He can be part of the board consideration and approval of what the management brings up. But in terms of the descriptions that I'm reading, where he seems to be taking the lead and, corresponding with Petro SA and so on, that is certainly not consistent with my understanding of the current legal framework that we have for GNPC. And so there are just many issues. But as I say, at the end of the day, if GNPC, was looking at a transaction of selling, 50% of the asset, they have to justify it in terms of the value that they're getting for the country, not resort to this, fictitious sort of preemption, explanation. And by the same token, if the ministry also has a transaction that it is looking to protect with Litasco, we need to understand that transaction clearly in terms of the terms on which that prepayment arrangement, yes, the terms under which that arrangement has been done, and whether they're comparable options, which could have given better value.
That's right.
So the nature of the transaction, and I mean, part of the concern that I have in this reference to Litasco is also because I recall a report of PIAC, I think around 2020, 2019, in which they again make reference to the fact that GMPC was actually compelled to make some payments for fuel supplied to car power ship by Litasco. Now, again, it was indicated that that was on the instructions of either the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Energy. And I think that is what raises one of the complications about GMPC, which have come up in various PIAC reports, that if you have GMPC essentially being seen as just an arm of government, and directives are given which are not necessarily consistent with the corporate decision-making framework of GMPC itself, then you run into issues, because that payment that GMPC made to Litasco, for instance, has been recorded by PIAC as a debt that is still unpaid to GMPC. And that constrains GMPC. So when you have a situation where there are many debts outstanding from government to GMPC, there are debts from Ghana Gas to GMPC, there are requirements by government for GMPC to fund cocoa roads or roads in the Western Corridor and so on. And you also read that GMPC is unable to fund its share of capital calls for, say, the Sankofa Ginyami project, or GMPC is unable to act proactively to deal with the gas handling issues that are constraining oil production in the Jubilee and 10 fields, then one should be worried. So essentially what I'm saying is that there needs to be a clear appreciation that GMPC was supposed to be a commercial corporate body that operates efficiently in terms of industry norms, and that is accountable to the government and to the people of Ghana for its decision making. But if the decision making is essentially what it is instructed to do here and there, then the lines get blurred in terms of responsibility. So who is really responsible for these decisions and their consequences?
But it also goes to beg the question of how this oil discovery over the period has impacted or contributed to our development as a country. Over these 10 years, according to the PIAC report, we've made over $10 billion as a country from the oil discovery. But are there tangible investments that we can point to and say this $10 billion has been used for?
Well, first of all, I think that one should be, quite pleased with the fact that oil production has generated $10 billion worth of revenue for government in this relatively short period since, oil production came actively into the economy. Now, I think that the impact on the country, of course, depends on how those revenues are deployed. In other words, those are government decisions, which are not necessarily GMPC's responsibility, because the government decisions as to how those resources are spent is what enables us to see whether they are being rightly spent. Again, when you look at some of the PIAC reports, they give clear indications that, unfortunately, some of the decisions of the Ministry of Finance in relation to expenditures are not consistent with the order of disbursements that have been scheduled. So that is where we should be looking closely. I think the PIAC reports provide a lot of information that tells us that the disbursement of the revenues is not always consistent with either the legal framework or what might seem to be in the best interests of communities all around the country. And it seems to me that that is where a lot of focus should be. You see, because, you know, as I said before, it's not changing the laws that will make those decisions better or worse. It is having the right decision making, you know, by people who are committed to the national interest. And when you read accounts in which some of the disbursements that are supposed to go to certain projects, the PIAC people go there
and they don't find them.
They don't find the project and so on. I mean,
but there was a typical case of a 6-classroom block that was recorded to have been built. They went there and they didn't see it. From the structure as it is now, the money from the oil revenue goes into the annual budget funding amount, ABFA, and government is charged to identify 4 priority areas to invest the money in. Between 2017 and now, what we've seen, at least with the PIAC reports that I have read from 2018 to date, is that this administration has invested a lot of the revenue that goes into the ABFA in the education sector because of free senior high school.
Yeah.
And their justification was that even though the law says the oil revenue should be invested in capital projects, they say that this is human resource capital investment, sort of. And that leads to the neglect of the other areas like health and so on.
Yeah.
Does that raise any concern?
Well, it seems to me that we're looking for transparency. If we find that the constraints that are created by the PRMA and the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, if we find that those constraints are not working well, or there's some emergencies that we have to address, I think we have to be upfront and, you know, raise that, have that discussed in Parliament and so on, and have, you know, a national appreciation of that position. But we can't go against the law and simply say that, you know, we think, in my mind, because otherwise it means that anybody can come into that situation and decide, if it's not free SHS, it might be some other pet project of, you know, whoever, you know, it might be, I mean, something that is of concern to a particular individual minister or whatever, but not necessarily a national priority. And that is where I feel that we need to be more transparent and upfront. If we find that there are certain constraints, let us face the situation. You know, I made reference to the fact that the legal provision which constrains GMPC's borrowing power against reserves is a bit of an undue constraint, because all the companies who are partners of GMPC are able to borrow against reserves. That's a well-known practice in the industry. They are able to borrow against reserves. And that, you know, can be done responsibly, because the funding sources are also monitoring your reserves, and they're monitoring how you're replacing the reserves, and they are monitoring your ability to repay them. So, and they're doing that, you know, systematically. So Talo cannot just go and borrow against reserves and then use it anyhow. But having a blanket constraint against that kind of activity, I don't find is in the best interest of the country. Because what it means is that if, as for instance, the situation now where, you know, government itself is so severely constrained in terms of its capacity to raise capital and so on. There's one, you know, additional point that I would like to, you know, to throw in. You see, I mean, recently, again, there's been back and forth discussion about the way in which, you know, power purchase agreements have generated a lot of costs for
of they say excess power.
Exactly.
In fact, the World Bank country director is quoted to have made that point.
Right. I think it's interesting that the World Bank is getting itself into the forefront of this discussion because, again, when I look back at this whole gas-fired power sector, which is where some of these issues are arising, the World Bank has made some serious mistakes in relation to understanding our national energy situation. In the 80s and early 90s, when GMPC, as a result of this gas mandate, was insisting that, based on all the evidence available, gas was an important source to complement and supplement the power from hydro sources. At that time, the view of the World Bank was against having additional capacity from gas resources. Because the argument of the World Bank, and the reason I'm raising this is because fuel costs are a major part of the problem that we have about the power sector. Fuel costs are a major part of the problem. And some of those fuel costs have to do with even going back to the use of light crude oil, when, again, this was at the insistence of the World Bank, that light crude oil was a better option because, and the reason was interesting, because according to their analysis and some of the consultants of VRA at that time, the thermal power was just going to complement the hydro. In other words, Ghana really didn't need additional capacity. Ghana just needed to complement in the 1 year in 7 when the water level was low. That was the position of the World Bank.
They insisted that we should use light crude oil.
So light crude oil for them was only going to be needed in the 1 year in 7 when the water level is low. So in 1 year in 7, you buy crude oil, rather than, according to them, commit yourself to a long-term gas offtake. Now, at that time, we were saying it's clear that, the country's growth is going to require more and more power. And, there's documentation which shows that they took a different position. They were on this trajectory of 1 year and 7. So VRA began to have to face the cost of light crude oil for the Abuazi plants. That was really the beginning of a lot of these high costs in the energy sector, which naturally came at a higher cost than what it would have been if you had planned ahead. In those days, we were projecting certain requirements for additional power based on the growth of the economy as we thought from the data that we had, from the different sources, And they said that VRA should not burden itself with getting locked into gas supply. They should rather go with light crude oil. And based on this view that the light crude oil will give thermal complementation during the 1 year in 7 when the water level of hydro is low. When you look at the situation today, if those gas projects did not go ahead such that gas supply became available to Ghana, how today hydropower is 32.4% or whatever of the capacity, the power sector capacity. Thermal provides 66 and more percent, renewable only a small percent. So, I mean, if gas had not been, insisted upon and developed, where would we be at? Again, the World Bank, which had in the past resisted GMPC's approach on gas, when it came to a project involving ENI and Vitol in the 2015-2016 period, the Sankofa Jinyami project, I mean, the World Bank could accept to guarantee payments to private sector companies at a gas price of $9.8 per million BTUs. That's a very high gas price. In fact, it's about 4 times the kind of gas price that they were saying we should be looking at, in the period when, we were having those discussions about gas. What they thought would be a reasonable price of gas and so on, 2.5, and later they were providing guarantees for a $9.8 price. I gather there's been some reductions in that price in more recent years, but basically the World Bank provided a guarantee, and that guarantee, I think, cost up, over half $500 million, because basically the World Bank was guaranteeing payments to the foreign companies involved, but at a time when GMPC was looking for some guarantees to develop its gas project, the World Bank thought, the country would not need that additional power. And so I think really, the country director should really go back a little bit into the origins of the problem of energy sector debt. And because, as I said, the crude oil and the effect it had on VRA, and the way VRA then had to go back to the government. And of course, you could never set a power price which would enable you to recover, sufficient for that kind of crude oil price. And those are problems which I believe the World Bank itself needs to face, because I think they owe it to us to be part of the solution, since they've been part of the problem.
They've been part of the problem.
Very much so.
The World Bank.
In its origins.
A period that I know means a lot to you and gets you into a mode of reflection. It's been many years down the line, but when you look back for this year, what are some of the lessons or the messages that you have looking back on the 18th?
June 18th indeed was the day when I was sent to prison. And I was in prison for 5 months until I had this health situation, an attack of asthma, which, to cut a long story short, led to my ending up in hospital, the Cardiothoracic Center, intensive care, and by God's grace, I'm still here. As I always say, they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And that lesson, from Joseph's experience has been very much in the forefront of my mind. I believe that as I'm still alive today, whatever contribution I can make in terms of the experience I've had in the energy sector, to ensure that, certain, decisions or certain directions, let me put it this way, certain directions are taken which can be beneficial for the country. I do feel an obligation to make them known. They may not be very comfortable in some people's ears, but that's the least that I can do. But the final point that I want to emphasize is that I think from the experience that I've gained, especially in the oil and gas sector, there's a lot that I have to share with the younger generation.
Indeed.
With the generation of people who today are having to grapple with a very dire economic situation of our country, and for whom the future can look extremely bleak. But, Ghana is indeed a resource-rich country. The fact that oil and gas can, even in this short period, begin to contribute so much, to the economy, I feel very confident that, if it's properly run, we have an institution like GMPC, which can contribute significantly, and contribute, in very large amounts in terms of value to the country's economic future. And I think that original vision of GNPC, being able to ensure the greatest benefit to the country from its own natural resources, that original vision for me is still a very powerful vision, which I'm very happy to share, with the younger generation. And I'm hopeful that it will be a vision that can be embraced without partisan political colors. Because frankly, it is not about partisan political colors. Where we are now as a nation is very, serious. And I think especially for the younger generation whose future is at stake, there is a particular responsibility, to share, what one has, been blessed with by way of appreciation of the industry and its capabilities. And so I hope that this will be the spirit in which our discussion will be received.
Indeed. It's been, 13, 14 years ago, I think? Have you forgiven your adversaries?
I never felt bitter. And as I've always said, I was very ready to let go, and forgiving them came very easily to me. I didn't really hold it, I didn't take it to heart. And I mean, I always also give credit to my dear wife, who, in the context of that, always, reminded me that in terms of, she always used to say, God is watching. That was her favorite expression during that period. And she said, God is watching not only those who were doing whatever they were doing against me, but God is watching me as well in terms of, whether the allegations that they were making were justified or not. In the end, I was acquitted and discharged completely, but I think that, in my heart, I don't bear anybody any grudge about that. I take it that God meant it for good. I wish that, in this country, we could have more of those, kinds of open exchanges, even amongst people who have been at different points of the political divide or whatever. But exchanges which are not just based on what my personal experience is and what he did against me and so on, but exchanges that look at what does the country take out of all these experiences, and what going forward should we learn. For instance, I always used to, in my discussion with President Mills, I always used to say that I would not, be able to support a repetition of what happened to me against people in the NPP just because it happened to me, so there should be retaliation. I couldn't support that. And of course, that was also President Mills' position. He was not about to...
But also change your regime, jail people without any reason. Exactly.
So that cycle of vengeance has to be broken. And I think the way to break it is by having more of, an interaction. And I'm very open to such interactions. And as I say, I meet some of these people, people who are involved in my prosecution and who, really had no business, taking some of the positions that they did. But I don't hold it against them. I think they thought at the time they were serving their political masters.
Indeed. Lawyer Tsatsu Tsikata, thank you so much, and we wish you well.
It's a pleasure. Thank you too.
Always.